The sound of my daughter's wine glass shattering against the hardwood floor of that private dining room is something I will never forget. Not because of the glass, because of what caused it. Because my son-in-law had grabbed her wrist so hard across the table that her arm jerked sideways, and the glass went with it, and the entire room went silent, and he leaned forward with a smile that had nothing warm in it and said, quietly enough, that only our end of the table could hear, "You sign what I tell you to sign. You do what I tell you to do. That's the deal. That's always been the deal." And his brother, sitting 2 seats away with his arm over the back of his chair like he owned the room, tilted his head and said, "She knows. She's just testing you. She always does this." Like my daughter was a problem to be managed. Like I wasn't sitting 4 feet away. Like the 40 guests who had come to celebrate my 60th birthday dinner weren't beginning to notice that something had gone very wrong at the head table. I set down my fork. I put my napkin on the table. And I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 62 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant, the last 14 of them as a senior investigator for the Ontario Securities Commission, before I retired to a quieter life in Oakville with my wife Carol and our garden and, I had hoped, our growing family. I thought I'd left the work behind. I thought I'd earned the quiet. But there are some things you cannot unlearn. There are patterns you cannot unsee once you've spent 3 decades learning to recognize them. And sitting at my own birthday dinner, watching the man my daughter had married grip her arm like a piece of property he needed to control, something shifted behind my eyes that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 31 years of professional instinct, finally pointing in the right direction. Let me go back. My daughter had been with my son-in-law for 5 years and married to him for 2. I'll be honest with you, I had liked him at first. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Confident, articulate, the kind of person who makes you feel like you're the most interesting person in the room when he's talking to you. He ran a real estate investment company out of Mississauga with his older brother. They had an office downtown and a website with professional photos, and the kind of testimonials that sound almost too good to be real, which, I would eventually learn, was because some of them were. My daughter worked part-time as a graphic designer and spent the rest of her time, increasingly, doing whatever her husband needed her to do. Admin work, he called it. Signing documents, he called it. I noticed she talked about her own work less and less. I noticed she deflected questions about their finances with a kind of trained smoothness that didn't sound like her. I noticed the long sleeves in warm weather, the way she laughed too quickly at his jokes, the half second before it came, the calculation in it. Carol told me I was projecting. Carol told me I had spent too many years looking for fraud in places where there wasn't any. Maybe she was right. A father's instincts are not always reliable, but they are persistent. The birthday dinner had been Carol's idea. 60 years old, she said. We're doing it properly. We booked out a private room at a restaurant in Burlington, the kind of place with linen tablecloths and a sommelier who actually knows what he's talking about. 40 guests, my closest friends, Carol's family, my daughter and her husband, his brother and his wife. My daughter had seemed nervous when she arrived. Not excited nervous, not the nervousness of someone who has been involved in planning a surprise or who has a toast prepared. She was pale. She excused herself to the bathroom twice before the appetizers were served. Her husband kept his hand on the back of her chair in the way some men do, the way that looks attentive to anyone who isn't paying close attention and feels like something else entirely to the person sitting in that chair. I was paying close attention. The incident happened halfway through the main course. I had watched my son-in-law lean over and say something to my daughter too quietly for me to hear. I saw her shake her head. I saw his jaw tighten. He said something else, still quiet, still smiling for the room, and she shook her head again, smaller this time. And that was when he reached across and took her wrist, and the glass went, and he said what he said, and his brother said what he said. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I had spent 31 years in rooms where the most dangerous thing you could do was let the other person know you had seen them. I picked up my phone and I opened my contacts and I scrolled to a name I had not called in 4 years. His name was David Park. He was 60 years old, Korean-Canadian, former RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, now running a private investigative firm in Toronto that specialized in exactly the kind of work I suspected I was going to need. We had collaborated on 3 cases during my time at the OSC. He was the most methodical person I had ever worked with, and when I tell you that I trusted his instincts more than my own, I mean it as the highest compliment I know how to give. The phone rang twice. His voice was the same as I remembered it, unhurried, precise. "Frank, it's been a while. I need you," I said. "Tonight. Can you come to Burlington?" A pause. "What's the situation?" I looked at my daughter, who was staring at her plate, her husband's hand still resting near her wrist, his brother watching the table with that half-smile still on his face. I looked at Carol across from me, who had seen what happened, and whose expression was doing something I had never seen it do before. "Domestic incident in progress," I said quietly. "And David, I think there's more to it. I need someone who can see the bigger picture." Another pause, shorter this time. "Send me the address. I'll be there in 45 minutes. I hung up and looked at my son-in-law. He was watching me now. The smile had not moved. "Everything all right, Frank?" he said. He called me Frank. He had never called me Dad. I had never asked him to, but I had noticed. "Fine," I said. "Excuse me for a moment." I got up from the table and went to where my daughter was sitting, and crouched down beside her chair. She wouldn't look at me at first. I put my hand very gently on her shoulder and said nothing. Just waited. "Dad," she said finally, very quietly, "please don't what? Don't make this into something." I looked at the red marks on her wrist where his fingers had been. "Sweetheart," I said, "I need you to listen to me. Someone is coming. Someone I trust. I want you to stay here until he arrives, and I want you to feel safe knowing that I am not going anywhere. Can you do that?" She finally looked at me. Her eyes were wet. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "How long?" she said, and I understood she wasn't asking about David's arrival time. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm asking you now. How long has this been happening?" She looked down. "Since before we got married," she whispered. I stood up slowly. Carol was beside me. She had crossed the room without me noticing, and she took our daughter's hands in both of hers and held them. I went back to my seat. My son-in-law raised his wine glass at me slightly. A toast of sorts, a small acknowledgement that he'd seen me crouching beside her, that he wasn't concerned. He should have been. David Park arrived in 43 minutes, which I mention only because it told me he had driven fast. He came into the private dining room with 2 associates, both of them wearing the kind of unremarkable clothes that mean you remember the room before you remember the people in it. He found me in the corridor outside, and we shook hands briefly. "Tell me what you know," he said. I told him everything. The wrist, the words, the brother's response, my observations over 2 years, my daughter's admission, the business I had been vaguely suspicious of but had never had cause to properly examine. David listened without interrupting. That was the thing about David. He never interrupted. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The company," he said. "What's it called?" "Warwick Capital Properties." Something moved across his face. Controlled, but there. "Walk me back inside," he said. What followed was quiet and efficient in the way that serious things often are. David and his associates entered the room and identified themselves to my son-in-law and his brother. The room had by this point largely understood that the birthday dinner had become something else. Most of the guests had the grace to busy themselves with conversations or to find reasons to step outside. My son-in-law stood up immediately. "Who are you?" he said. "This is a private function." "I was invited by the host," David said, nodding at me, "which means I have every right to be here. I'd like to ask you a few questions." "I have nothing to say to a private investigator." "That's completely your right," David said pleasantly. "But I'd ask you to remain in the building for a short while, out of courtesy to your father-in-law on his birthday." The brother stood as well. He was larger than my son-in-law, broader across the shoulders, with the particular confidence of a man who had rarely been told no. "We're leaving," he said. "Of course," David said. "I'll make a note of that." Something in the way he said it, the absolute absence of alarm in his voice, made the brother pause. I had seen David do this before. He had a way of making his lack of concern feel more threatening than any raised voice could. They stayed. David sat with my daughter for nearly an hour in a corner of the room. Carol stayed beside her. I watched from across the room as my daughter talked, slowly at first, then with a kind of unstoppable momentum, like water finally finding a crack in a dam. I watched her use her hands when she talked. I watched her stop looking at her husband's direction every 30 seconds and start looking only at David, who listened with his notebook open and his pen moving steadily. Meanwhile, I sat down with one of David's associates, a woman named Sheila, who had been with him for years, and who had the manner of a parish accountant and the eyes of someone who had processed a great deal of human wrongdoing without being surprised by any of it. She asked me about the business. Real estate investment, I said. Residential properties. They position themselves as a company that helps homeowners in financial distress sell quickly, below market value, but fast. No commissions, no hassle. They've been operating in the Greater Toronto area for about 4 years. Sheila was writing. And what made you suspicious? I thought about how to answer that. I'm a forensic accountant, I said. Or I was. When someone tells me their business is growing 30% year over year in a market that's been declining, I want to see the books. I never asked to see the books. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. But my son-in-law bought a lake house in Muskoka 18 months ago. Cash transaction. And 2 months before that, his brother bought a condo in Collingwood. Also cash. And last summer they both drove new vehicles. Not financed. Purchased outright. I paused. On paper, their company shows modest revenue and modest margins. Those purchases don't come from modest margins. Sheila stopped writing and looked at me. You've already done some of this analysis. Old habits, I said. She turned her notebook toward me and tapped a blank page. Write down everything you remember. Every property name, every transaction detail, every figure. We'll cross-reference tonight. An hour after that, the Burlington police arrived. My daughter filed a report. The officer documented the marks on her wrist, photographed them, asked her questions gently and without hurry. My son-in-law stood against the wall with his arms crossed, saying nothing, having apparently decided that silence was his best available strategy. His brother had called someone on his phone in the corridor. I saw him through the glass partition, speaking quickly, his free hand moving, and when he came back in, his expression had changed from contemptuous to careful. Before they left that night, David pulled me aside. Warwick Capital Properties, he said again. Frank, that name came across my desk 8 months ago. A complaint filed with the Real Estate Council of Ontario. An elderly woman in Scarborough who said she had sold her home for $230,000 below its assessed value after a company representative told her the neighborhood was declining and she needed to move quickly. She was 79 years old. She'd lived in that house for 40 years. He let that sit for a moment. The complaint was investigated and closed due to insufficient evidence. The complainant couldn't substantiate that she had been deliberately misled. I felt something cold settle in my chest. How many complaints? That I know of? That one. But I'm going to make some calls tonight, and I suspect the number is going to grow. He was right. I cannot tell you exactly how right he was, because the full picture did not emerge all at once. It came together over the following 8 days in the way that these things do, piece by piece, each piece revealing that the piece before it had been even smaller than it appeared. My daughter stayed with us that night. She slept in her old room for the first time in 3 years, and in the morning she sat at our kitchen table with both hands around a mug of tea and told us what she had been carrying. It had started, she said, before the wedding. A comment here, a correction there. The particular cruelty of small humiliations delivered in private, so that the person on the receiving end begins to wonder whether they are imagining things. He was never loud. He was never what you would call aggressive in the ways people expect aggression to look. He was cold, systematic. He had a way of making her feel that every problem in their life together was the result of something she had done or failed to do, and that the solution to every problem was to trust him, to listen to him, to do what he said without asking questions. The documents she had been refusing to sign, the ones that had caused the incident at my birthday dinner, were power of attorney forms, broad ones, the kind that would have given him legal authority over her financial affairs. He had been asking her to sign them for 6 weeks. She had been stalling. She didn't know exactly why she was stalling. She said it felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. I told her that was enough. That feeling was enough. The business, I said carefully. Did you ever see anything? Hear anything? She wrapped her hands tighter around her mug. There were calls, she said. Late at night, after I'd gone to bed, he'd go down to his office. I could hear his voice through the floor, but not the words. And there were files on his home computer. I never looked at them. He was very clear that I was not to go into his office when he was working. She paused. Once I brought him a cup of coffee without knocking. He closed his laptop so fast he nearly knocked it off the desk. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me until I left the room. 8 days later, David Park called me and asked me to come to his office in Toronto. When I arrived, there were 3 people I did not recognize sitting around his conference table. He introduced them. An investigator from the Ontario Securities Commission, my old employer, which felt strange, and then felt right, a detective from the Toronto Police Financial Crimes Unit, and a representative from the Real Estate Council of Ontario. How familiar are you with predatory equity fraud? The OSC investigator asked me. Professionally familiar, I said. Then this will go quickly. She opened a folder. Warwick Capital Properties has, over the past 4 years, purchased 47 residential properties in the Greater Toronto Area and Hamilton. In 31 of those cases, the vendor was over the age of 65. In 24 of those cases, the vendor was a widow or widower living alone. The average purchase price was 38% below the assessed market value at the time of sale. She let me do the arithmetic. I did it quickly, and then I set it aside because I needed to hear the rest. In at least 16 cases, she continued, we have evidence that the vendors were given materially false information about their neighborhood, their property's structural integrity, or their legal options prior to the sale. In several cases, they were told they were facing imminent tax liens or utility disconnections that did not exist. In 3 cases, we believe the vendor's signature was obtained, while the vendor was under duress or not fully competent to sign. 31 properties, 47 total. The cash transactions, the lake house, the condo, the new vehicles. How much total? I asked. Conservative estimate of fraudulent gain? After accounting for legitimate operating costs, somewhere between $4 and $6 million over the 4-year period, potentially higher. I had spent 31 years looking at numbers. I had reviewed hundreds of fraud cases. I did not consider myself a sentimental person about figures. But I thought about that 79-year-old woman in Scarborough who had spent 40 years in her house and been told her neighborhood was declining, and something in my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with mathematics. Your son-in-law, the OSC investigator said, is identified in our preliminary review as the primary operator of the scheme. His brother is identified as cooperator and primary point of contact with vendors. They split responsibilities in a way that was likely designed to create plausible deniability. Your son-in-law handled the financial structuring. His brother handled the in-person vendor contact. She paused. Your daughter's name appears on several corporate documents as a listed director of 2 numbered subsidiaries. We don't believe she had any substantive involvement or knowledge. But the fact that she was listed is consistent with the pattern we're seeing. Her husband appears to have used her identity as part of the corporate structure in a way that would have given him protection and given her exposure. That was why he wanted the power of attorney. If things fell apart, he needed to be able to make decisions using her name, and if investigators started looking at directors, her name would come up before his. I was very still for a moment. Then I said, "What do you need from me?" What they needed from me was considerable, and I gave them all of it. Every observation, every figure I had noted over the years, every conversation I could recall, every transaction detail I had written in Sheila's notebook at the birthday dinner. I gave them the name of the institution my son-in-law banked with, based on a detail my daughter had mentioned once in passing. I gave them my analysis of the purchase timeline and the corresponding lifestyle upgrades I had documented. I had not intended to document them. I had been doing it without fully admitting to myself that I was doing it the way you do when 31 years of professional habit refuses to go entirely quiet. David told me later that my documentation had accelerated the investigation by several weeks. My daughter had moved back home with us. She contacted a lawyer, a woman recommended by a domestic violence organization that Carol had found, and began the process of separating herself from her husband, legally, financially, and in every other way. The process was not simple. Her name was on a mortgage. Her name was on corporate documents she had signed without understanding. Untangling her from the structure her husband had built required patience and precision and a very good lawyer, and she had all three. She also had something else. She had started talking, not just to lawyers and not just to us, but to herself, in the way people do when they are finally letting themselves process what has happened to them. She talked about the years before we could see it. She talked about how it felt to be slowly convinced that your own perceptions were unreliable. She talked about the specific loneliness of being in a marriage where the person you are supposed to be closest to is the person you are most afraid of. She cried a great deal. She also, as the weeks went on, started laughing again, the way she used to laugh before she met him easily, at small things, with her whole face. My son-in-law was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 4 weeks after my birthday dinner. His brother was arrested the same morning at a different location. The search warrants had been obtained the previous evening. The officers who executed the warrant at their shared office building later told David that they had found, among other things, a filing system of vendor profiles organized by age, financial vulnerability, and estimated property value, a targeting document, essentially identifying which elderly homeowners in which postal codes were most likely to be successfully pressured into a quick sale. That document, David told me, was the thing that shifted the case from serious to devastating. My son-in-law called my daughter from the police station. She didn't answer. He called twice more. She sat at our kitchen table and watched her phone ring and did not touch it, and I sat across from her and watched her not touch it, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. His lawyer, a man who arrived at the police station within an hour of the arrest, which told you something about the relationship, attempted to negotiate. He suggested his client would cooperate fully in exchange for reduced charges. The Crown prosecutor, a woman I never met, but whose name I learned later, and whose thoroughness I came to respect enormously, declined to negotiate on the primary charges. The brother's wife retained separate counsel and gave a statement within 48 hours of the arrest. She had known, she said, not the full scope of it, but she had known enough and said nothing, and saying nothing had felt, for a long time, like the only safe option. She had watched what her husband's brother did to my daughter, and had understood, at a level she had never spoken aloud, what it meant to say something and have it dismissed. She was not charged. She became a witness for the Crown. The preliminary hearing took place the following spring. My daughter testified. She had been preparing for months, working through it with her lawyer, working through the emotional parts with a counselor she had found in Oakville who specialized in coercive control. When she walked into that courtroom, she was wearing a dark blazer, and her hair was back, and she looked like herself, the version of herself she had been before she married him, and also a new version, one I had not seen before, with a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before any of this happened. She testified for 4.5 hours over 2 days. Her husband's lawyer tried to suggest that her testimony was motivated by the divorce proceedings, that she was painting an unfavorable picture of her husband to gain advantage in the separation. My daughter looked at him and said, without any particular heat, "My husband listed me as a director of a company I had never heard of in order to use my identity as legal cover for a fraud scheme. He obtained my signatures on documents by misrepresenting what they were. He kept me financially and socially isolated to ensure I had no independent means of verifying anything he told me. I have documentation of all of this. The advantage in the divorce proceedings I am seeking is the return of assets held in my name that I did not know existed until investigators contacted my lawyer. That is not testimony motivated by spite. That is testimony motivated by the hope that what happened to me does not happen to anyone else." There was a silence in the room after that. The judge did not call for order. No one needed to. The trial proper began in the autumn. 43 individual victims were identified. 31 of the original vendor cases produced criminal charges. 11 families were represented by a civil attorney who had filed a class action suit against Warwick Capital Properties and its numbered subsidiaries. The OSC laid additional securities charges related to the corporate structure. The Real Estate Council of Ontario initiated its own regulatory proceedings. My son-in-law was found guilty on 27 counts, including fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, uttering forged documents, and criminal harassment. He was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. His brother received 7 years. The asset forfeiture proceedings took another 8 months, but when they were complete, both men had lost their properties, their vehicles, their bank accounts, and their corporate holdings. A restitution fund was established for the victims. The lake house in Muskoka was sold. So was the condo in Collingwood. The 79-year-old woman from Scarborough, I'll call her Mrs. P, because her full name is hers, to keep received a settlement payment that allowed her to purchase a smaller home in the same neighborhood she had lived in for 40 years. She had moved into a rental unit after selling her house. She had not told her children about the sale because she was ashamed, and she had spent 18 months believing the shame belonged to her. It did not. It never did. She wrote a letter to the prosecutor's office. She wrote another letter to my daughter, through the victim services coordinator. I was not in the room when my daughter read it, but Carol told me later that she read it twice and sat for a long time afterward, and then said, quietly, that it helped. That knowing Mrs. P had her house back helped. I think about that a lot. 1 year and 3 months after my birthday dinner, my daughter and I were sitting on the back deck of our house in Oakville on a Sunday afternoon in late September. The leaves were turning, and there was that particular quality to the light that you only get in southern Ontario in the fall, the kind that makes even ordinary things look like they've been considered. Carol was inside making tea. The dog was asleep under the patio table. My daughter said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "That night at the restaurant, when you reached for your phone," she paused. "Were you angry?" I thought about it honestly. Yes. "But you didn't show it." "No." "How?" I turned that over for a while. "I've spent a lot of years in rooms with people who had done very harmful things," I said finally. "And I learned early on that the most dangerous thing you can do in that situation is let them see you react. Because if they see you react, they think they still have control. And if they think they still have control, they make decisions based on that assumption. I needed your husband to believe he still had control until the moment he didn't." She nodded slowly. "You knew, didn't you? Even before that night, you knew something was wrong." I suspected. "Why didn't you say anything?" I looked out at the garden. Carol had planted hostas along the fence line that summer, and they had done well. "Because I wasn't sure," I said, "and because you hadn't asked me, and because I told myself your mother was right, that I was being suspicious out of habit." I paused. "And because I was afraid that if I pushed and I was wrong, you'd pull away. And I couldn't bear that more than I couldn't bear my suspicions." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You weren't wrong." "No," I said. "I wasn't. I think about the people who didn't have a father who noticed," she said. "The people like Mrs. P who didn't have anyone sitting at the table with them, who didn't have a David Park in their phone, who went home that night and signed the documents, because there was nobody who saw it for what it was." She looked at me. "That's the thing that keeps me up at night, not what happened to me. What happened to all the people who went through something similar and had no one." She was working, by then, as a volunteer with a legal aid organization in Hamilton that assisted older adults with housing and financial issues. She had started going on Tuesday evenings and had begun asking about whether there was room for someone with graphic design skills to help with their public awareness materials. There was. By the time autumn came, she was there 3 evenings a week, and talking about whether she wanted to pursue something more formal, a course, maybe, something in advocacy. She had also, and this mattered more than anything else I could tell you, started sleeping through the night. Carol noticed it first. The way she came downstairs in the morning without that careful, braced quality she'd had for so long. The way you move when you've been living in a house where the sound of someone else's mood can change the entire day before it's even started. She made coffee now, without hesitating about which mug to use. Small things. The kind you only notice because you'd been watching for their absence. Carol and I had a conversation once, not long after everything was settled, about whether I had done the right thing that night. Not making the call, neither of us doubted that. But the way I had done it, the waiting, the control. Some people would have stood up, Carol said. Some fathers would have gone across that table. "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about my son-in-law's face, the way he had smiled at me when I came back from crouching beside my daughter. The absolute confidence of a man who believed he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. Because that's what he expected, I said. And because if I had, we would have had a brawl at my birthday dinner, and he would have walked away that night and gone home and made our daughter pay for it, and the business would still be running. And Mrs. P wouldn't have her house back. And he would have been right that he was the most dangerous person in that room. Carol was quiet. Making the call was more dangerous than going across the table, I said. He just didn't know it yet. There's a particular thing that happens when you spend your career following paper trails. You start to understand that power is almost never where it announces itself. The loud man in the room is rarely the one you need to watch. The one you need to watch is the one who built the structure that makes the loud man possible. My son-in-law was loud in private and charming in public, and he believed, genuinely believed, that those two tools were enough to protect him from any consequence. His brother believed the same thing. They had used them successfully for 4 years, and they had no particular reason to think that a 60-year-old retired accountant at a birthday dinner was going to be the thing that undid them. That is the thing about arrogance. It makes excellent criminals, and it makes them sloppy in exactly the ways that matter most. David Park and I have lunch occasionally now, downtown Toronto, a Thai place near his office that he has been going to for 20 years. We talk about the case sometimes, and we talk about other things. He told me once that the birthday dinner case, as he calls it, had been in some ways the most satisfying of his career. Not because of the sentences, because of the scope of what the investigation recovered. The restitution payments. The 43 families who got something back. Not everything, never everything, but something. You did that, he said. My daughter did that, I said. She testified for 4.5 hours. She did, he agreed. But she needed someone to make the call first. I have thought about that word, call. We use it so loosely. A phone call, yes, that night to David. That was part of it. But there was another call being made at that table. A decision. A choice about what kind of person you were going to be in a moment when being a different kind of person would be so much easier. When keeping the peace would let you get through the evening and go home and tell yourself it wasn't your business, or that you didn't know enough, or that you'd look into it later, or any of the 100 other things we tell ourselves when we don't want to see what's directly in front of us. My daughter had been living in that house for 2 years. The fraud had been running for 4. 43 victims, Mrs. P, and all of it, every thread of it, had been sitting in plain view for anyone who knew how to look. I knew how to look. I had just needed a reason to start. I'm 62 years old. I was a forensic accountant for 31 years. I have reviewed thousands of documents and sat in hundreds of depositions, and I have learned in all of that time that the most important moment in any investigation is not the arrest. It is not the verdict. It is the moment when one person decides that what they are seeing is real, that it matters, that it requires them to act rather than turn away. My daughter is free. Mrs. P has her house back. 42 other families received something, partial, imperfect, but real. One phone call. One decision to trust what you can see. One choice not to let the loud men in the room be the most dangerous ones. I would make it again. Without hesitation. I would make it 1,000 times. That is what you do, when you see it, when you know. You do not wait for a better moment or a cleaner situation or a version of events where the cost is lower. You pick up the phone, you make the call. You trust that the people on the other end will answer. In my experience, the right ones always do.